Students, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence. First, some historical background. America, the United States of America, starts out as a colony that is controlled by England. England established its control over North America by starting the colony of Jamestown back in 1607. And England would control not only Virginia, where Jamestown was located, but the other colonies for many, many years to come. And in fact, most of that time, the people who lived here as English colonists were fairly satisfied with the way that England ruled them and controlled their lives. It wasn't until the 1760s, 1770s when people started to become maybe a little bit irritated as to what the English government was doing. And we get things like people writing declarations of independence. So let's explore how that developed over the years by going all the way back, looking at the way things were before, and the factors that contributed to the change that took place. So when you look at how England governed the colonies for most of the time that it was doing so, Great Britain or England looked at the American colonies as something that they possessed, but it was something that they wanted to sort of strongly control and also protect. I mean, there were a lot of resources and a lot of trade opportunities over here in America, and England just wanted to make sure that they got out of it what they wanted to get out of it. So they set things up in such a way that kind of benefited England, but the side effect of this was that it benefited the colonies in a lot of ways as well. The main way that England shaped how it governed the colonies was through these laws called the Navigation Acts. And the Navigation Acts regulated trade going into and out of the colonies. The main rule of the Navigation Act was that the colonies could only trade with England. They could not trade with France, they could not trade with other countries in Europe, they could not trade with Asia, they could not trade with Africa. If they wanted to trade with those other countries, they had to do it through England. So essentially everything is going into and out of and through England, if you're talking about trade in the colonies. The purpose behind this is to make sure that colonial trade benefited England, and this helped England get very, very rich off of the resources that America had to offer in the market that America gave them as a place to trade goods. This worked pretty well. Both sides of the ocean, England and America, were satisfied with this. And so the colonies fall into this phase that historians call salutary neglect. This is essentially a term that is used to describe England's attitude and the colonial attitude in the early 1700s. So, 100 years after England has established colonies over here. And just like the term implies, the whole idea behind salutary neglect was that as long as things were safe and orderly and colonists were following the Navigation Acts, England, Great Britain sort of left them alone, let them do their own thing. Internal matters, local affairs, that kind of stuff was all being handled over here by colonial leaders. As long as the Navigation Acts were being maintained and as long as all of that trade was going through England, England was satisfied. And Americans, for the most part, were satisfied as well, because being a colony of England made them essentially a part of one of the more powerful countries on the globe at that time, and there were a lot of benefits that came along with that. This begins to change in the mid-1700s when England goes to war with some other European powers. The famous war that historians remember as kind of the big turning point is the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War was a war that was fought over land. There was a war going on for land simultaneously in Europe, but the conflict that happened in North America is referred to as the French and Indian War because it's the English and their colonists versus the French colonists in Canada, and Native Americans. and this was fought entirely for land. England wanted land that France controlled in North America, and they fought one another for it, essentially. England would win the French and Indian War, but at great cost. It took a lot of money to pay for armies and soldiers and ships. England is fighting France not only over here in North America, but in other places around the globe as well. So it was a very costly victory. And the English government at the end of the war was saddled with quite a bit of debt and had to figure out a way to pay for all the war expenses. So the debt that England is facing and some other problems and situations that England tries to solve end up creating a situation where American colonists start to dislike their British leaders. People who had once been proud to be subjects of this guy, the King of England, were suddenly starting to have a problem with him. This problem really came out when you started talking about taxes, because the way that England decided to solve its debt crisis at the end of the French and Indian War was to tax the colonists. And they were, in their own minds, totally free and able to do this, but the problem was colonists in North America, remember, they were used to being almost neglected by the British government, were used to setting their own tax policies, and a lot of colonists got resentful over the fact that England, who'd been ignoring them for all of these years, is suddenly telling them what they can and cannot do with their own money. Here's some examples of the new taxes and new regulations that England is imposing. Notice that they're imposing taxes on items that many people would consider luxury items. Things like tea and sugar. Paint was taxed. At a certain point, they had stamps that had to be put on legal documents. These were all taxes that England saw as being fair because they were on luxury items. But Americans, again, kind of took offense at this because they thought that England was trying to basically take control of where their tax money went. The other thing that really infuriated colonists is that England set up a kind of an official imaginary boundary on the western border of the colonies and told people that they could not claim land beyond that out in the west. This was particularly irritating to colonists because many of them had gotten involved in the French and Indian War for the sole reason of taking over land. So between the taxes and the new land regulations, Americans are starting to have a real problem with the sort of things that England is telling them to do. American colonists start to respond to what they view as the problems with England by protesting. Peaceful protests turn into violent protests. This image that you see here is a scene with American colonists tarring and feathering a tax collector. The scene that you see here is the Boston Tea Party, where colonists disguised themselves as Native Americans and threw tea off of a British ship into the harbor. This image down here is an image of the Boston Massacre, where essentially British troops fired into what may have amounted to a riot forming on the streets of Boston. All of these were part of protests that American colonists orchestrated against the British government. Eventually, colonists form a military to fight against Great Britain. Here you see an image of American soldiers who are fighting for American independence from Great Britain. To really make the world aware of what America was fighting for, the Declaration of Independence was written. It was written, of course, by Thomas Jefferson, and it was essentially a way that America justified their split from England with a statement that heavily leaned on British Enlightenment philosophy and a list of the problems or issues that America had with England. The main philosopher that Thomas Jefferson borrows ideas from is John Locke, who is, of course, from England. John Locke was a big proponent of these rights, these ideas here. Natural rights, a social contract, consent of the governed, and the right to rebel. In the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson points out that Americans have these natural rights. There's a social contract between us and the leaders of Great Britain. According to John Locke, good government should come with the consent of the governed, and that people who are living under an oppressive government have the right to rebel. So essentially what Thomas Jefferson is doing is he's using John Locke's words, which is of course English philosophy at this time, as a way to justify the American Rebellion.